So I'm going to be looking at an excerpt from the book I wrote, Comparative Grammar of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. If you're learning any of these languages, I highly recommend you get my book. It's on Amazon. I'll link to it in the description below. But let's just jump right into it. I want to talk about nouns in these three languages. So here we have the three languages, Swedish on top, Norwegian, and Danish. And right off the bat, you can see they're pretty similar. This is a book and then the book. So first thing you'll notice is that when we say the book in Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish, we put the word en at the end of the word. And if it's before the word, it becomes a. So a book, but then we say something like book the or book a, book the. And in Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, there are two genders. There's the common gender and the neuter gender. If you studied a Romance language like Spanish or French, you'll know that there's masculine and feminine gender. But Old Norse, which is where these languages came from, used to have masculine, feminine, and neuter. But over time, masculine and feminine became common. And then it was just common and neuter. I think some of the other Germanic languages, this also happened, like Dutch. And some of the Germanic languages like Afrikaans and English, there's actually no more genders. There's just one gender. So in English, we just have a book and the book. But in these languages, if you want to say a something that is a neuter noun, you're going to use the word et. ET or ETT for Swedish. And yeah, if you want to say the book, you have to put the word at the end. So it's like book the. That's something you'll get used to as you just repeat that over and over again in the languages. But something I want to show you is that in Swedish and Norwegian, you can see with book, it ends with K, which is k, which is an aspirated sound. If you put your hand in front of your mouth, k, and say the k sound, the k sound, you'll feel a puff of air. And if you do the same for the g, bug, then you won't feel the puff of air. So it's unaspirated. And we're going to come back to this because we'll see that in some of the other letters, Swedish and Norwegian use the aspirated, meaning there's a puff of air, whereas Danish uses the unaspirated form. And in this case, we have the K's and the G for Danish. So let's look at some example sentences. We see already the word for I is pretty similar. We have J-A-G for Swedish, and then we have J-E-G for Norwegian and Danish. Yeah. But the interesting thing is that even though A and E is two different letters, the sounds are actually very similar because we have an open A, like an ah sound, and then the E is like an sound. So ah and they're very close, very similar. For the word have, we have har for both, for all of them. Then we have en, which is A, and then we have kat, which is in Swedish and Norwegian a double T, and Danish a single T. So the spelling is a little bit different, but basically we have the same words here. Now, here's something interesting is that if you look at the word black, you'll see it's the same for Swedish and Norwegian, but it's different for Danish. And if you look at the word for is, you'll see that it's the same for Norwegian and Danish, but it's different for Swedish. Now, I think this is quite common to see Swedish or Norwegian the same and Danish different, as well as Norwegian and Danish the same and Swedish different. However, there are some times when Swedish and Danish are the same and Norwegian is different. I'll try to point that out later on. But I think it's more common to see Swedish and Norwegian the same with Danish different, or Norwegian and Danish the same and Swedish different. Swedish and Danish the same and Norwegian different is a bit rarer. You'll also see down this second example sentence, a lot of the times the letters will be the same, but the vowel sound will be a different vowel. So for the verb reads, lese, we have this A with an umlaut, and then we have E for Norwegian, and then we have the AE together like this for the Danish. You'll see that the words are very similar. Sometimes they're spelt a bit differently. Swedish just missing the E between the T and the R for interesting. Also, you'll notice that in Swedish and Norwegian, they'll use the P in the word, where Danish will use the B. So these words for bots are very similar, but the P sound and the B sounds, again, I think that's an aspirated versus unaspirated difference. The P has the aspiration, the B does not. So that's another case, just like the K and the G, where Danish is the unaspirated form, Swedish and Norwegian are the aspirated form. So if you look at the example sentences, you'll see very, very similar. In the case of Norwegian and Danish, and this one, they're exactly the same. Swedish is almost the same, different spelling with et, and the verb for is a different vowel. But besides that, it's basically the same thing. So yeah, these languages, very, very similar. Sometimes you'll see different words, like in Swedish we have bro, and then in Norwegian and Danish we have good. And so that's a difference in vocabulary, but if you look at the rest of the words, yeah, they're pretty much the same. Same here with he has a dog, the dog is friendly. Almost exactly the same. You'll notice that Swedish uses this A with the umlauts a lot, whereas Norwegian and Danish use the E. And that's just the only difference here in these sentences. Again, we'll see here with apple, Swedish and Norwegian use the aspirated P, whereas Danish uses the B. And that is the difference. You'll see Swedish uses a different verb than Norwegian and Danish do here. But let's see what else. We can come down here. I include this table just to give some side-by-side comparisons of a chair, the chair, and you can see it's the same across the board. You'll notice that the neuter nouns use ets and use et at the end instead of n, which is for the common nouns. I talk about countable and uncountable nouns, but let's skip ahead to plural. Plural is very interesting because in English we just usually have an S at the end of the word, and then that makes it plural. But Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish are a bit trickier. There are some general guidelines that I put in, but these are not hard and fast rules. You need to memorize the plural form most of the time to know what's going on. However, there are some, let's say, patterns. For example, for birds, you'll often see this pattern of AR for Swedish, ER for Norwegian, and E for Danish. But again, this is not a hard and fast rule because books, we have ER at the end for all of them. For cars, we have AR, and then we have ER for both Norwegian and Danish. Dogs, here's another example of that pattern, AR for Swedish, ER for Norwegian, E for Danish. Sometimes we'll even see an EN for Swedish at the ends, ER for the other ones. Sometimes there's no ending. But yeah, you really have to learn the plural form along with the singular so that you know what it is. But don't worry, it's not too difficult to pick up. You begin to sense patterns. But here's where it's tricky because you see Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. The same word for table is bord. But for Danish, there's an E for the plural, whereas Swedish and Norwegian, there's nothing. It's the same as the singular. And again, you'll see for bird, this is a typo. I'll have to correct this and re-upload it to Amazon for you. This should be fugla, but you'll see birds in Swedish, it's the end is AR, and then ER for Norwegian, E for Danish. For shoe, it's sko for all of them in the singular, but then we have an R at the end for the plural in Swedish, but it's the same in Norwegian and Danish. So yeah, very tricky. Again, we have AR at the end of day, dog, and then ER for Norwegian, E for Danish. And yeah, you just have to be able to think about what the plural is, memorize it, and get it down. You want to make sure you know these differences, because if you're speaking Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish, you don't want to confuse them or mix them up. The best way is to have them written out side by side like this, so you can see the differences right in front of you, and that's a great way to learn. So if you remember the definite nouns, when we say the book, we say boken. We have the N at the ends, which means when you want to do the plural of the definite noun, so if you want to say the books, we have to say books the in the languages. So we put the at the ends. And for Swedish, we have adding na for the N words, the common words, and adding N at the end for neuter words. And then for Norwegian and Danish, we usually just add ena for all of them. But again, this is not a hard and fast rule. Let's take a look at some real examples. So we see for Swedish, we have arna at the ends for books, and then we have ena for Norwegian, and then we have arna. We have that R slipping in, the erna for Danish. And again, we have erna for Danish, ena, and ena for Swedish. If we come down to this table here, this might make it more clear. So the interesting thing is, I feel like Norwegian has the simplest way of making the plural, because if you look, you'll often see this ene after all of them. So you'll see all these have E, ena at the ends. This is a little different with the R and E, but for the most part, you'll see E and E. However, if you go to Danish, you're going to see sometimes it's the E and E, but sometimes it's an ER and E. So this is ena, 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 but then these are erna, 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 and then ena. So where Norwegian was almost always ena, in Danish, sometimes it's erna and sometimes it's ena. Then when we go back to Swedish, it kind of has its own pattern. We have the orna, the erna, for the common nouns, which are the nouns that end in en. But then when we have the neuter nouns that end in et, it goes to en. So you can see huset, husen. Whereas for Norwegian and Danish, we just have husena. So those are the basic patterns. Norwegian, I think, is by far the simplest and easiest to learn. Danish is a little bit trickier because sometimes it's erna, sometimes it's ena. And then Swedish has its own pattern with the arna and the en for the common and neuter nouns. And I'm going to end this with the genitive case. So in English, when we want to say, for example, Robbie's book, we just put S at the end. So my name is Robbie, but if we want to say Robbie's book, we put an S at the end of Robbie, and then that's how we make it the genitive case. That's how we show possession. It's the same thing basically in Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. You add an S to the end, but you don't put an apostrophe. So you can see here, we're adding an S. For example, the dog's ball, we have S after hunden. And yeah, we just add the S and no apostrophe. And that's how we get the genitive case. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this little lesson about Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. I do have a special treat for you. I made an audio file that has native speakers speaking Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish back to back for example sentences. If you want to get that absolutely free, look in the description of this video, go to my website, and you can download that file. Also, I highly recommend you get my book, Comparative Grammar of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. It's 401 pages long. It has the history of these languages. It has a grammar, all the grammar. Plus at the end, I add comparative example sentences of not only Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, but also Icelandic and Faroese, which are also Scandinavian languages in this language family. So you can get a full picture of the Scandinavian language family. So definitely pick up this book if you're studying one of these languages, or if you're just a language enthusiast like myself. You definitely want to pick up this book. I can't recommend it enough. You will definitely get your money's worth if you buy this book. So that's it. Look in the description for the Amazon link. I hope this helped. Thank you so much, and we will talk again soon.